Hi everybody, welcome. By way of introduction, my name is Melissa. I'm a first-year MBA student at the Kellogg School of Management and part of the DECO team here tonight. For those of you who are new, I'd love to give you a little bit more background on what Decode is about. Decode is the largest tech and innovation forum jointly hosted with UC Berkeley and Stanford student organizations, alumni networks, and entrepreneurship centers. The organization features speakers at the forefront of technology, innovation, and entrepreneurship from around the world. The mission of Decode is to give students, founders, and investors a platform to share, connect, and be inspired. Over the past 5 years, our annual Decode Innovation Conference have had over 10,000 audiences every year. Some of our notable speakers include founder and CEO of Zoom, board member of Tesla and SpaceX, CEO of Y Combinator, and CEO of Google X. Our most recent conference last October had garnered 1.3 million views across 44 countries and have thus prompted us to kick off this speaker series, with today being our fifth session. Our next speaker will be on April 7th, so stay tuned for more details on that. So on to the logistics for today's event. So after the fireside chat, there will be a Q&A session, and you can send in any questions that you have for our speaker, Keith, via the Zoom chat. We'll go through as many questions as possible. For those of you who are selected to join our roundtable session with Keith, you should have received an email from us confirming your spot, and we will be inviting you to join a separate breakout room directly from the Zoom meeting after the Q&A session ends. So please do stay around to receive that invitation later on. It looks like Keith and Shuo are in the room, which is great. And so, yeah, for tonight's session, we're pleased to welcome Keith Enright. By way of introduction, Keith serves as the Chief Privacy Officer of Google and leads the global privacy legal team there. He joined Google in March 2011. Prior to joining Google, Keith served as the most senior privacy executive at two Fortune 500 online and offline retail enterprises. He was a senior consultant for a leading global consulting practice and a general counsel for a privately held advertising technology company. He has more than 20 years of experience in creating and implementing programs for privacy, data stewardship, and information risk management. Keith has been a featured speaker discussing online privacy and related subjects on NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams, CNN, NPR Talk of the Nation, and other major media outlets. He has been a guest speaker at Harvard Law School, Stanford Law School, and MIT, and is frequently featured at industry events focusing on tech, privacy, and data protection. This session will be moderated by Shuo Chen, who is a general partner at IOVC, a lecturer at UC Berkeley, and a faculty member at Singularity University. Without further ado, let's welcome Shuo and Keith.
Thank you very much, Melissa. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our session today, and a huge warm welcome to Keith for joining our event today. We're really excited to have you here. It's a real treat. So thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, so to start, maybe we'll jump right in. Maybe we could start a little bit with your story of how you became Chief Privacy Officer at Google and what exactly being Chief Privacy Officer means.
Sure. Wow, we could burn through all our time if if I don't keep this tight. So yeah, my journey is a strange one. I went to law school thinking I was going to be a patent lawyer. Well, undergrad, studied everything that would not be relevant to this. I was a I got 2 degrees. I did a degree in political science and philosophy with minors in history and anthropology. So I ended up doing kind of 2 undergrad degrees. Then went to law school to be what I thought was going to be a patent lawyer. That pretty quickly didn't agree with me. So I pivoted to employment law, did that all through law school, almost went the big firm route, then kind of panicked at the last minute. And instead I had set up a website about privacy law for no good reason other than just kind of intellectual curiosity at the time. I was really interested in the intersection of technology and law, and back in the late 90s, there was no real privacy practice. So it seemed like kind of an interesting thing, thinking about the way Moore's law and computational capacity was going to collide with the diminishing cost of storage. Like those two things intersected in a place I thought was pretty interesting. So I set up a website. That website resulted in outreach from a .com in California just before the first .com bubble. I ended up getting a job while I was still in school as a director of privacy programs for a startup called All Advantage. That was one of these ones. It sort of flamed out magnificently. And then I bounced into a very early stage startup called Lucira, which was a laptop security company. Was there for about a year. It was kind of an interesting experience, had some fun adventures there, and then bounced over to another startup called All Advantage. Add Knowledge in Kansas City. And that one turned out to stick. That was young founder and CEO creating some ad tech technology. Went in there, became the general counsel, was there for a few years. They took some outside investment from TCV just after I left, and they ended up kind of breaking up into a bunch of other companies, some of which did quite well. I bounced out of Ad Knowledge, went over to IBM because I had, at that point, never worked for a real company before. I had just bounced from startup to startup to startup. I went to IBM and became the privacy technology lead for their security, privacy, and wireless practice, consulting for the federal government. Did that for a spell, bounced from there to Limited Brands, which most of you will know as the parent company of Victoria's Secret, but we had about 4,000 stores at the time. Did that for about 3 years, and then from there went to Macy's, became Macy's first chief privacy officer, which was just a really interesting adventure, sort of this iconic 150-year-old brand that was just beginning to figure out what to do online. We had just launched Macys.com. It was a very, very modest business relative to the overall size of the brand. So it was a fun time to be there. I thought I would spend the rest of my career there. I was sure I was going to be a Macy's exec when they buried me. And then Google reached out to me. I got a cold call from somebody at Google asking if I was interested in recruiting, in being recruited for a position leading the privacy program. So that was in 2010 in October. My interview process commenced through March of 2011. So that mythology of how horrendous Google interviews used to be, I lived that. And joined Google in 2011 and have been there ever since. And that has just been a crazy wild ride. It has been a ton of fun. I am supremely confident that I will be here for a very, very long time. What does it mean to be chief privacy officer? Probably not the same thing in any two companies, though I would say that is less true every day. So when I first started doing this, I was one of the first chief privacy officers almost 20 years ago. And then it didn't mean the same thing truly in any two companies. I had a legal background. Many CPOs had legal backgrounds. They were essentially legal advisors to companies. But there wasn't a whole lot of law. So a lot of it was reputational risk management, things like that. But you had a lot of CPOs that were coming out of marketing, coming out of human resources, coming out of totally different functions based on the culture of the company they were serving and how they perceived the need. At Google, we could spend the rest of our time talking about sort of privacy at Google and my job at Google. I sit on a group called Privacy Council, which is several of Sundar's direct reports. I report up into the General Counsel's office. And we think about what's right for Google's users, and we try to align that with Google's global product strategy. We try to understand all of the existing legal requirements in all of the places around the world where our products and services are offered. We also try to look around corners and look at trend lines. What do we think our users are going to expect from us 5, 10 years from now, which is extraordinarily difficult in the space that we're moving in now and the velocity we're moving at. And we try to plot a responsible course for the company. And it is an interesting and uniquely challenging portfolio of work. So yeah, I'm sure we'll talk more about that in our other questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your story, especially as we even discussed before that privacy space is a quickly emerging industry with a lot of opportunities for different talent. So if it's okay, we'll backtrack to kind of the beginning of your career and talk through the different phases a little bit, because you've really done everything from startups to very traditional companies, 150-year-old, to now Google being very much at the forefront of tech. But if we backtrack all the way to your experience working with startups, what are some of the lessons that or advice that you would give to students and young professionals now thinking about those experiences, things that you wish you had known back then about working with startups?
Yeah, wow, so much. So, startups were extraordinarily fun. I wouldn't do anything differently if I could go back and do it all over again. There is there is so much that I didn't know when I started stumbling into it. Again, this was the first dot-com bubble. This is about 1999. And I don't think many people fully understood the distinction between the sort of the ethereal wealth of stock options and sort of real money. So everyone was taking these strange, hard to value offers with unspecified numbers of options and everything else. And they were leaving salary on the table. And frankly, they were accepting unlivable wages because everybody felt like they were guaranteed some immeasurable wealth at some point in the future because everything was just going to be huge and nothing was going to fail. I learned a lot through all of that. Like, in hindsight, if I kind of compress all of it, the thing that I wish I understood was how little money mattered at the front end. It matters that you can meet all of your responsibilities and all of your obligations and provide to your family, whatever your family situation might be, carry your debts and all that. But making incrementally more money in the first 5-10 years of my career, it just didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. What really mattered was the density of experience, the diversity of experience, kind of amassing a set of skills, abilities, and experiences that were going to make me exponentially more value in the later chapters of my career, when frankly, your capacity to generate value is so much greater than it was at the front end too. I mean, I get that that's antithetical to common knowledge in Silicon Valley, where it seems like everybody has the opportunity to be a trillionaire in your 20s if you just make some really good decisions and you're in the right moment at the right time. But for me, like, looking across the thousands of people I've worked with over the last 20 years in tech and in startups and extrapolating from those first couple of years, the best advice I think I could give someone, and I give it quite frequently, is don't obsess over incrementally more income at the front end. Like, look at the best opportunity, the most interesting opportunity, and preferably, the work that actually excites you. It sounds like a cliche, but it's so true. If you chase the opportunity that's most interesting, it's probably gonna sort of set you on a journey that's gonna land you in a much better place later on.
I think that's really good advice, especially for students or even folks who have just been in their first few years of career. I think it's important to hear that when they're evaluating different opportunities between ones that are better compensated versus less so, it sounds like to go for, as we were talking about earlier, riskier adventures that guarantee more learning in the end. In terms of fast forwarding a little bit ahead towards your time on the consumer side, would you say that your role within a larger consumer or even traditional company is just completely different compared to your role now, very much on the frontier of technology?
So I don't think anything is quite like Google, like in my experience. We could talk more about that. But what I would say is I think my time in specialty retail, right? So at Limited Brands and Macy's, it was far less different than I think one would intuitively presume. I didn't know going into retail how entrepreneurial that entire industry actually is. I mean, folks think about Black Friday and they realize that in November, many of these businesses live or die. That's when they suddenly break into the first profitable quarter of their year. Like, it's easy to say that. It's terrifying to live that, right? Like, when you are actually in that business, I didn't know what my income was going to be at Macy's until a few days after Christmas, basically, because so much of our bonus was associated with the performance of the business across holiday. And most of the year, you are flying completely blind and you're just hoping that the merchants are making good decisions. So, like, I actually feel like the entrepreneurial spirit, the risk taking, and the velocity in specialty apparel, it feels an awful lot like the feeling that you have when you are at a high growth startup. You're not sure how it's all going to work out, and you are living hand to mouth year to year in some ways. So, and all of that was interesting. It was also, I had a novel experience in that time because both of the businesses I was involved with, Limited and Macy's, had interesting e-commerce plays that were sort of really interesting moments of their own development. Victoria's Secret was a leader. They had a $2 billion online business back sort of around 2002, 2003, I would say. So they like they were way out ahead of everybody else, and they were kind of creating the space as they went, which was a really interesting place to be. Again, it felt very much like the kind of the psychology that you feel in many of the teams that feel like they're building the future here in Silicon Valley. Macy's was definitely different. Like they were proceeding with trepidation into a space that they did not feel like they understood. And they were trying to figure out how do they do that in a responsible way without cannibalizing or destroying their core business, which was already sort of beginning to show some signs of fragility around them. So to summing it all up, not as different as one would probably think. There are definitely commonalities, especially around risk appetite and entrepreneurism. But yeah, it was at Macy's. In contrast, I found myself in Herald Square going up the world's oldest all wooden escalator one day, right? Like these are the kinds of experiences you don't find yourself having here in Silicon Valley for sure.
Yeah, and I was actually going to do a quick follow-up, which is in your role at Limited as well as at Macy's, what does being Chief Privacy Officer mean in those particular roles?
Yeah, so Limited's an interesting example. Again, Limited was a very unique company at the time. You had this founder, Les Wexner, who had created this incredible empire of specialty apparel brands. They were being run almost adversarially, which was just kind of a fascinating experience. Each brand was living to its own P&L, and they were the success that they would realize was based on sort of a almost competitive model between one brand between the next. That created a really interesting and unusual culture. The moment that I joined was a really interesting moment. A guy named Len Schlesinger, who had come over from Harvard B School, was the new COO. And what he was trying to do was take all of the information assets from each of these brands and merge them into one coordinated enterprise data warehouse to create cross-sell opportunities. Basically, there was this idea, I think, right, that it was going to prove exponentially more value across the entire portfolio if they started sharing what they knew about their customers. Now, the woman who hired me at Limited, a woman named Susan Saggitello, who was the chief marketing officer, she had previously been the chief marketing officer of a company called DoubleClick that many of you probably recognize long before it was a Google company. So she understood, again, for those who were keeping score way back when, DoubleClick got hammered by an FTC investigation for merging online and offline data in a way that just crushed their value for a while. Susan had lived through that, so she hired me to help them navigate this data integration without sort of realizing those risks of sort of hitting any of those tripwires. What was interesting for me is she wouldn't let me tell anyone that I was a lawyer. She didn't want anyone to know that I was a lawyer. She wanted me to represent myself as just this e-commerce advisor, this data expert. And that affected the way that I thought about the way I presented myself to the business. So one of the things that was so interesting about Limited is it was a merchant-driven culture. It was a place where you needed to constantly be thinking about how do you enable the business to achieve the goals that they're setting out for themselves. Because again, these merchants are under a massive amount of pressure to deliver quarter to quarter. That affected my entry into Macy's, in that when Macy's first tried to recruit me from Limited, they offered me the job of chief privacy officer, reporting up to the general counsel, a guy named Dennis Broderick, whom I loved. He was just a great human being. And I turned him down flat. I had said, I'm sorry, you are even more of a merchant culture than the place that I'm leaving now. If you put me in this job, in this place reporting to you, they're going to treat me as damage and route around me. I'm not going to be able to do the job for you that you need from me. So I walked away from the opportunity. And then about 48 hours later, he reached back out to me and he had said, "We come down to my office and talk to me one more time because we were intrigued. We might just take your advice on how we fill the role if you don't take it." So I went down to his office and he literally just rolled out an org chart onto his desk and he said, "Pick a president. You can report to any president in the organization, just pick one." So I found a president, a guy who was the president of Credit and Customer Services, who owned all of the customer data, also operated, we partially owned one bank, we wholly owned another bank. We also did the full employee benefit program and everything else. So I basically inserted myself into the nerve center for the way that information was moving across this massive organization. And I learned a ton. I got to sit on the board of the division that operated the bank. So I learned a lot about financial services, learned a lot about sort of the operation of an employee pension plan from the folks that were running that. It just, again, coming back to this thing, it didn't advance me in a linear way. based on some sort of blueprint I had for my own career in my own head, but it allowed me to aggregate all sorts of interesting sort of perspectives and bits of knowledge, which uniquely qualified me for the thing that came next. When Google ultimately reached out to me, it was because of this bizarre diversity of experience that I had assembled that I had kind of created this snowflake resume that nobody else had at the time.
I think what's really interesting is that you've really been able to build different pieces of your career together over time through just very unexpected moves of roles to the ultimate end that you're able to design exactly the role that you're working in. And I think it's that perspective that's extremely valuable, especially for folks who are relatively earlier in their career, to think about not just so much as what is available, but so much as what am I passionate about that I can build towards. Especially since it sounds like some of the roles that, especially for current students, that they may be working towards even a decade or two later in their career might not even exist now as a job title. So I think that's a really interesting way to think about the future. And in terms of your role at Google now, obviously we're dealing with information and data on a whole different scale than even ever so before. So would love to learn a little bit more about your tenure at Google as well, since 2011 onwards, how your role has evolved over time.
Sure. Yeah, again, it's a longer conversation than we probably have time for here to do it justice. I was hired in a woman named Nicole Wong, who is my most valued mentor for my entire career. I think she's actually a Berkeley Journalism School grad, if I remember correctly. She brought me in. I didn't know it at the time. We were just about to sign a consent decree with the Federal Trade Commission because of a failed product launch that some of you may be familiar with called Google Buzz. We tried to launch this social network. It failed magnificently and caused all kinds of problems because it didn't behave in the way that it was expected to. So I was brought in to basically build out a privacy program inside of Google that would be auditable by the Federal Trade Commission, because we had this requirement under the consent decree that they would come in every other, or that an external assessor would come in every other year for 20 years and confirm that we were actually operating a privacy program that was appropriate to a company of our scale and complexity. So that was the original job. That's what I was hired in to do as senior counsel. As we got that work underway, privacy just kept becoming more and more important, more fundamental to Google's understanding of its own success. So the team grew, the role grew, the opportunity grew. We became sort of a two-part function. I led the privacy legal team. I had a counterpart, a woman named Alma Witten, who led security and engineering. So she was a director who had sort of technical chops, understood Google product infrastructure and all that. And the two of us partnered together to build out this privacy program. Again, the world kind of marched on. We had a really interesting event in that Larry Page decided that he wanted to make it clearer to our users that information that was produced or collected in the course of their use of any individual Google product or service could be used to improve their experience of any Google product or service anywhere in the whole portfolio. That seemed intuitive to people who were at Google, but when we looked at it, we realized we had, because of how quickly the company grew, acquisitions, product evolution, and all of that, we had something north of 80 different privacy policies, which, hundreds of pages that someone would have to read through just to understand the rules of the road as to the data that we were collecting and processing for them. So Larry wanted us to clean that up. We had also taken pressure from outside regulators who were saying, this is incomprehensible, privacy policies are terrible, you need to figure out a better way to communicate with people. So we had this big ambitious project where we decided we were going to collapse all of these privacy policies down into one that was going to be more readable, more accessible, just a better tool for users to understand what we did with their data. So we did all that work. We communicated out super broadly all over the world. It was described as we littered the internet with notice, because we told everybody that we were updating our privacy policy. We were not reducing their rights. We weren't sort of trying to slip one past the goalie on this, but we wanted them to understand that there was one place for them to look. And if they didn't want to be governed by that privacy policy, they had 30 days to sort of step away from their Google account, or this was going to be the policy that governed the way that our services worked. That went over fine in the US. Federal Trade Commission was totally happy with our approach. There were no issues. Europe got grumpy. We had several regulators in Europe suggest what you're about to do is all wrong. We decided to proceed anyway, because we were confident that we were on the right side of the law in this, which resulted in 6 national investigations being kicked up across Europe. So 6 different countries launched investigations. That fundamentally changed the shape of my work at Google. And ironically, I would say almost entirely for the good. So what ended up happening is my job became less about just building and defending this internal program and counseling product teams and leading lawyers who were counseling product teams on how to comply with the law. And it became this much more interesting hybrid of inward and outward facing work. So I spent almost 3 years of my life, it felt like, on planes to ancient cities all over Europe, meeting with these people. And we had, up until that point, I think we viewed privacy regulators as adversaries. They were folks who were trying to prevent us from innovating, prevent us from doing great things for users. They didn't understand us. They didn't understand tech. And we were wrong. So I took about that period of engagement. It was super humbling. I realized many of these people were incredibly sophisticated. They were mission driven. They were trying to protect the fundamental rights and freedoms of their citizens of their countries who had kind of created their jobs and paid their salaries. And we learned a ton. We just got so much better. So that was across, say, 2013 to 2017, probably was the bulk of that work. We closed out all these national investigations. We got better. Our products got better. Our account settings got better. Our privacy policies got a lot more readable and accessible. And frankly, we made friendships. Like, we built collaborative, collegial relationships with these regulators all over the world. And then, incredibly, there was this massive change in the law, the GDPR, which many of you were paying attention to, in 2018. And we were set up for this incredible success, I would say. Now, we had our own compliance challenges going into the GDPR. We spent hundreds of years of man hours kind of figuring out how to make sure that we were in a defensible legal position. But the people on the other side of the table were generally not hostile to us. They didn't think we were lying to them. They didn't think we didn't respect them. They knew that we were making a good faith effort to comply. And that was massively useful. And it also, frankly, just made my job and the jobs of the people that work with and for me a lot more fun. You know, like showing up to work to build things that we felt like the people on the other side of it felt pretty good about, and that they knew we were engaging in good faith and trying to do good work. Those are some of the best years of my career so far. Now, interestingly, fast forward to today or the last year, and you look at COVID-19, shelter in place, don't let anybody on planes, everybody is kind of communicating like this. That's been extraordinarily hard, I would say, for the way that my job and the work of my team had evolved to involve so much face-to-face engagement, so much relationship building and kind of collaborative work to sort out very vague and ambiguous requirements and how do we bend technology to meet them. That's a lot harder to do over VC. Ironically, all of this super high-tech stuff is much easier to do when you're face-to-face in sort of meet space with your counterpart, and you have the ability to look each other in the eye and try to figure it out. So I am quite eager and anxious to get back to the next chapter when we are all able to kind of share space and engage at arm's length again. I think we'll be better at our jobs, and I think the world will be better for it. Sorry, that was a super verbose answer to your question.
No, that was perfect. I think it's really great to see how your role has evolved at Google over time, especially given your collaboration or what has turned into a collaborative effort with regulators. Because I think oftentimes for everyone on this event now, we'll tend to think of regulators as, well, just whatever is covered in headlines, but at least being able to attach personal relationships and that collegial working relationship to contextualize some of those headlines, I think is really helpful. To have something very specific for everyone on this call's reference, though, would it be possible for you to share some of the top kind of 2 to 3 surprising things that you learned just about how to work with regulators that you didn't know about before?
Yeah, for sure. The simplest and single most valuable thing that I learned was the profound value of getting on a plane and going to where somebody else lives. That it sounds so idiot proof, and it did not necessarily come natural. I mean, I was probably a bit of a tourist in the front end of my Google career because I had never worked at a place before that was ready, willing, and able to fund you going to other parts of the world. So that was kind of a fun part of my early Google adventure. But when I think about the change that happened rapidly in the span of 1 or 2 or 3 meetings in Ireland, England, Germany, Rome, it changed me. Like, it changed me to recognize that just showing up is such a massive signal of deference and respect and willingness to engage. When, again, Silicon Valley probably can benefit more from this than anywhere else in the world. There is a caricature of us that is widely understood around the world. We think we know better. We think we understand better. We move faster, and other people are just sort of struggling to keep up. Making that go away by showing up, listening, and taking that feedback home with you. And frankly, for me, like, even educating your own executive team on the benefits of that, and then delivering on it, like actually delivering better outcomes as a result of taking the time and showing up and not presuming that just Batmobiling and trying to impress and amaze the world with your brilliance. That was the biggest thing, for sure. And then there's a whole bunch of things that kind of follow that, I would say. Showing up shows delivered massive value, and then the becoming increasingly aware of the fact that, you know, we're a global company, right? For a long time, and again, I think most companies that are moving at this velocity have some period where they think, I'm a California company, maybe organized under the laws of Delaware or something, and I'm going to carry the risk to move fast and just kind of try to do as much as I can and build great stuff. And then users will follow and we'll solve those other problems later on. Like, those are long tail compliance problems we'll sort out down the road. I don't think that's a tenable strategy anymore. Almost anything that is worth doing right now or the vast majority of things have this incredible capacity to scale globally at a historically unprecedented rate. You need to anticipate that. So recognize that you are probably going to have to account for an incredible diversity of perspectives and requirements and strong feelings. And to the extent you can, at a minimum, be prepared for that flexibility and not be too rigid in your thinking. That's going to give you a competitive advantage down the road when other people are trying to move faster than you.
I think you've coined a great term, Batmobiling of Silicon Valley around the world. I think what's really unique about your role now is that you really kind of sit at the center of not just working with regulators, but also with policymakers internally within the company who are building product firsthand, partnerships with other corporates. We'll come back to talk about specific partnerships in a bit, but sitting in the center of just coordinating with all of these different stakeholders, obviously direct users as well. How do you start to balance some of the different voices that come into the equation? And what are some of the right channels to get real firsthand information? Of course, we talked about meeting in person with regulators, but in terms of feedback from users, because there's just so many of them, in terms of how do you align everyone internally and then work with policymakers? There seems like there's so many voices at play here that it's very difficult to manage everyone.
Yeah, wow. There's so many interesting parts of a comprehensive response to that. One is, I think we as a species are at an inflection point right now where I am cautiously optimistic we are sincerely going to grapple with the challenge of having truly representative, inclusive, equitable conversations with different kinds of people all around the world. Obviously, tech has had its challenges with that in a variety of ways over the last several years. And these are real and hard problems that, are going to take a whole bunch of work. So I think that's part of it, recognizing that having inclusive conversations in any of these areas, whether it's product design, whether it's regulatory strategy, whether it is talking about sort of the ethical or philosophical consequences of a product or feature that you're contemplating, it is most of the major failures that I've seen across the last several years, and many of them tragically avoidable failures, are attributable to the fact that people did not, in fact, have an inclusive conversation, because a marginal investment in inclusivity at the front end would have probably produced perspectives that would have allowed folks to just think a little bigger and avoid some avoidable and really tragic outcomes. In terms of how we deal with that, right now, I would say we're experimenting, right? We, notwithstanding, I think, sort of the general perception, right in some areas, wrong in others, that Silicon Valley is uniquely challenged in creating open and inclusive conversations. I am seeing very sincere efforts to try to solve that. I think, we work hard. I sit in a group called SLT, which is a senior leadership team for the legal department inside of Google. And one of the things that I have been advocating for, that my GC is a tremendous advocate for, is kind of aggressive empathy. It is very easy when you, especially now in this completely virtualized environment, when you are sitting in a conversation and you might have 10, 15 people, you're looking at the sort of Brady Bunch arrangement on a screen, there might be enough visible diversity for you to presume that you are having an inclusive conversation. And one of the things that I've learned is, even just looking at Google, right? We are somewhere in the region of 100,000 employees distributed all over the world right now. It is perilous to presume that even the group of leaders that I'm engaging with, without a very deliberate, active effort, is going to be able to anticipate and factor in the priorities, needs, and requirements of team members, even that are sitting in London or Munich or Singapore or Kuala Lumpur or somewhere else. Like, not only is, there's so many ways that you can think about the diversity of perspectives there. Some are simple, right? It is, and especially in leadership and in certain kinds of conversations like product design, you do have sort of clustering that happens, right? Leaders tend to be a little more senior. Being a little more senior may correlate with being a little more tenured. Being a little more tenured may correlate. You end up finding out that unless you actively work against it, you really do have significant distortions kind of in those things. I am encouraged that I am seeing folks recognize this more explicitly than they ever had before, and working hard to figure out ways to correct it. So, sorry, that was a little meandering, talking about inside of the company, inside of the culture, the way that I see us grappling with it, sort of opening up the aperture a whole lot and talking instead about, from a privacy perspective, the way that we think about this in product. So this has actually been a massive devoted effort for us for many, many years. We actually have an entire program where we solicit participants cross-functionally, multidisciplinary people from different parts of the organization, that we create these pods and we send them to different parts of the world, all over the world. And we engage with actual users that are sort of psychographically, demographically different. And we ask them questions. We ask them to engage with different kinds of products. We ask them to work through some of our controls, maybe navigate through our privacy settings, come back, tell us what made sense, what didn't make sense. And then we look at that data. How did folks in Hamburg respond to all of that different from folks in Tokyo? What does that mean? We have a very strong, deliberate bias to commonality of approach across our entire product portfolio everywhere in the world. We want to deliver the best version of everything we do to every user everywhere in the world. Sometimes that gets hard if you have unique or idiosyncratic requirements in one jurisdiction, but we really push hard to try to do that. That is a really interesting challenge in product design, when you are actively soliciting this feedback and you are really trying to understand differences in culture and perspective from different users across different age groups and different kinds of communities in different parts of the world. How do you create my account? How do you create sort of the home site for all of your Google account settings in a way that is going to provide the same kind of value and control and empowerment to all of those users all over the world? We've invested a ton of time and attention and effort into doing this, and the work's never going to change, right? It's never going to stop, because the users are changing, the technology is changing, and users kind of innovate with our products too. They use them in ways that we didn't even necessarily anticipate at the time we brought them into market. So it's in a constant state of flux. It's incredibly fluid. It is a profoundly complex and interesting problem. It's a fun one to grapple with, and you're inevitably going to be carrying some risk, because you'll almost certainly get it wrong sometimes.
I think it's really interesting to look at it from a data privacy perspective, because in some ways you're at the forefront of driving innovation in terms of working with regulators to ensure that you can maximize the kind of innovation you can bring to the market. And on the other hand, you're also taking this from a very defensive approach in terms of thinking about, how do I ensure fairness and equity and efficiency for everyone who is a user and stakeholder in the ecosystem. I think I will ask you one last question, and then I'll take some questions from from the audience. Anyone who has a question, you're welcome to actually either message me in chat. I've gotten a number of questions in chat, or just to the broader group so we can have that for reference. The last question I did want to ask you is this interesting space of being able to collaborate with other corporates in this space. Last time when we spoke, you mentioned that there's some really interesting stories from the back end about this whole partnership that Google did with Apple on putting together COVID-19 contact tracing technology. And how do you balance between obviously providing what as a product is serving the public good versus data privacy of its users and working with even regulators on pulling all of this together? So would love to hear from your perspective how this whole thing took place.
Yeah, wow. So this is probably another 45-minute talk that we could get into at some point in the future. Let me try to abbreviate it as best I can. For those who were not kind of aware of the work, we, at the front end of COVID-19, I was being approached by regulators and lawmakers all over the world who were asking or demanding for access to the sort of hypothetical location data that they assumed that we had because of the Android operating system and the number of phones that it kind of powers around the world. I found myself in a lot of extremely redundant conversations where I had to explain a bunch of things to folks. A, we don't have the data that you think we have because location history is an opt-in feature that a lot of people don't opt into. The data is not super accurate in location history. Will often put you on the wrong side of the road or the wrong floor of the building or something like that, which for contact tracing is dangerous. And contact tracing, that data wouldn't be useful for contact tracing anyway, right? Contact tracing is a well-established, over 100-year-old methodology for manually mapping how an infection may have moved across a population. And this data wouldn't really empower that. So trying to explain this to people and still wanting to be helpful, but wanting to not sort of have them wasting cycles trying to sort of work through something that wasn't going to help them solve the problem. Right about that time, several academics inside of Google and outside of Google seem to have a slightly parallel epiphany. They're like, well, wait a minute, what if we used proximity data instead of location data? And sort of lights went on all over the place. There were folks at Stanford that were looking at this. There were folks at MIT that were looking at this. We had internal engineers that were looking at it, and apparently folks at Apple were looking at it. So a bunch of conversations were had as we tried to sort out, is there a there there? Is there a thing to do? It became clear relatively quickly there might be something useful to do with proximity data. Both we and Apple had done different things in that space. And if we put our heads together, we might be able to move farther faster. And for us to do this, we kind of would have to work together because as the two most common mobile operating systems, you wanted that reach in order to maximize the value. And it wouldn't be for contact tracing. We wouldn't be doing contact tracing. We would be providing a new data set to contact tracers so that they would be able to do their work better. We had a bunch of interesting challenges that we saw sort of even coming out of the gate. One was we had a technical problem. Nobody had ever tried to bend the low energy Bluetooth signals to do this thing. Can you really tell if someone's 3 feet versus 9 feet versus 15 feet away? People hadn't really figured all these things out before. We didn't know about signal fidelity. We didn't know about error rates. It just wasn't as important in the past. So engineers had to kind of start collaborating and sorting that bit out. Then we had a general public policy problem that we needed to sort, which was there were different ideas about the right way to do this. Some public health authorities and some academics and government agencies thought you should create a centralized registry that's run by the government. All of the phones should feed data back up into that registry and everyone should trust their government to do the right thing with it. And that was going to deliver the best outcome. Others, including ourselves, were nervous about that in that it would be very hard to prevent abuse or repurposing of that data set later on for things that we didn't think were appropriate and that we didn't necessarily want to be building a surveillance architecture that could be repurposed later on. So we needed to have that debate. We weren't sure that we were going to be able to have it successfully because we're dealing with sovereign states that have a right to do stuff that we don't get to tell them not to do sometimes. And then the last thing was there was going to be an adoption problem, right? In that even if we got steps 1 and 2 right, we built the best technology in the world, we got regulators on board. If users didn't trust it, then we wouldn't get sufficient adoption, and the thing wouldn't be used, wouldn't actually be able to materially advance the public health problem that we were trying to assist with. So, well, and there was another bit to that last bit, which was nobody knew that this was actually going to help, right? Like that we were presuming that maybe this data would be useful in assisting public health authorities and contact tracers to do the thing that they needed to do anyway, better, faster, at a bigger scale. But we might have been wrong, right? And if we were wrong, that could have been disastrous. We wanted to be careful that we weren't causing all of these folks to waste resources focusing on our sort of technical wizardry, if in fact they should have been devoting all of those resources just directly to traditional contact tracing. So huge, complicated global problem with the potential to save lives if we got it right. Doesn't get more serious than that. And this unique opportunity where sort of our frenemies over at Apple we were looking at each other. Fortunately, we had some great history. Jane Horvath, who's the chief privacy officer at Apple, was my colleague at Google before she went over to Apple. So, and one of the lead lawyers on her team had recently joined Apple from our team over at Google. So there were synergies there. There were trust relationships that made a lot of it work really well. There's always been massive engineering respect between the Apple teams and the Google teams as well. So there was almost an eagerness, I think, at the tech level to work together because they don't frequently get the opportunity to do that. And then our leaders were inspiring, right? Like I will always remember Sundar saying, I understand the risks and I understand this is not necessarily in our business best interest, right? Like there is no business play. Someone could argue there's a reputational benefit here, maybe, but probably not if we get it wrong, right? Like it could totally bank the other way. And this could be a disaster if it goes wrong. But Sundar and the leadership team were like, it's the right thing to do, right? And no one else can do it but us. That was like the interesting variable to hear them recognize no one else could do this but Google and Apple at that moment in history. And they gave us free rein. So me and a small handful of other people were tagged with being a bit of a SEAL team to begin exploring this. And then that ballooned into this massive effort across Apple and across Google. We worked together. It was exhausting and fun and challenging. And we learned a ton. So one of the sort of the immediate learnings that came out of all of it, we collaboratively felt sort of bizarre showing up with regulators, with our competitor alongside, who is frequently criticizing us in other contexts. And then we find ourselves advocating for the same thing and advocating for this privacy first approach. One of the big design principles that we anchored on was we were not going to do a centralized database. We were going to maximize processing on the phone. We were going to make it maximally private. Some folks were critical of that because they were afraid we were over rotating towards privacy, possibly hurting efficacy. That was the big learning. After all of it, that was the big takeaway from my discipline, which was there was a presumption that if you optimized for privacy, it was at the cost of efficacy. That was the headwind we had to get through. It took us months. But what we learned, and what I think all of the folks on all sides of the conversation that were really actively in the weeds with us on it learned, was that was an erroneous presumption. Optimizing for privacy had no demonstrable efficacy cost at all. And in fact, if you think about those sort of 3 stages of challenge I outlined at the beginning, they were massively beneficial because maximizing for privacy dramatically improved adoption rates and improved the probability that we were ever going to get this thing voluntarily installed on users' devices, and without which it would have failed anyway. So even if we had built something that was 5% more effective, if it was potentially at risk of becoming a surveillance tool, people wouldn't have installed it and it would have been useless and just sort of gone into the annals of history as a failed effort at corporate collaboration. So yeah, we learned a ton. We could talk a whole lot more about it, but in broad strokes, that's what that adventure was all about.
Thank you for sharing that adventure. I think it's so important to hear it from the back end. And also from your perspective that actually prioritizing privacy is in the long term, not just great for personal protection, but also for efficacy of this particular initiative. I'm starting to get a number of questions come in, so maybe I'll kind of group the different questions categories together. So one vein of questions from a few folks is, backtracking to your startup days, when you were deciding which startups you wanted to look to work at, especially for your earlier work experiences, what are some of the things that you were looking for, and your advice for how to select where to go early in your career?
Yeah, so I will use the benefit of retrospective wisdom to make myself sound a whole lot smarter and more thoughtful than I actually was. For me, the startup thing was entire serendipity, to be completely honest. I was panicking because I had realized that I was not going to be a good fit for the big law jobs that were presenting themselves. That was terrifying to me. I was also acutely aware that I had amassed an alarming amount of student loan debt, and that was going to limit my optionality. So sort of the job that presented itself first was the one that I wanted. And if it paid a living wage, that was enough to sort of get me even more interested. I was lucky that it happened to land me in this ad tech, sort of super high growth, VC funded, lots of visibility. Like, it coincidentally had a ton of attributes that proved to be super useful to me later on. Now, if I were advising a friend who was at that stage in their career, I would say, you know, again, to sort of be a little cliche, like, try to get some sense of where you think the puck is headed and skate there. That was what I did accidentally. If I did it deliberately, I would have been a genius, right? Like, I was thinking about the fact that privacy was probably an interesting area of intellectual pursuit because of compute and storage and all that. I was never thinking that I should go there because it was going to sort of make me professionally successful. I wasn't even thinking about it as a professional move. If you could tie those things together, like, look at trends that you are seeing, and you are all so well placed to do this. Like, being at Berkeley and Stanford, there's nowhere on earth where if you just put your ear to the ground and listen to what your colleagues are doing, pay attention to what fellow students are kind of excited about, and gather a bunch of those signals and try to look for points of intersection across those ley lines of innovation. That's where it is, right, folks? You can look at what people did with crypto. You can look at what people are doing now with NFTs. Like, there's all kinds of stuff that's sort of insane or interesting or whatnot. It's all there, and that's what I would say. Look for folks who are doing something innovative at one of those intersection points of different things that seem interesting, but not fully mature and not fully realized and not fully understand yet. Because if you can understand them faster and you can distinguish yourself as an expert when there's a deficit of expertise, that's what happened with me. I became a privacy expert when no such thing existed. And that just basically picked me up in a current and swept me forward for the remainder of my career. I think that happens every single day for folks who either are smart enough or lucky enough to just land in that spot.
Well, as a Canadian, I love the hockey analogy of skate towards where the puck is headed. So that's great. I am getting a few questions down kind of the vein of career development in the privacy space. So this is not really the general gist of the question is that there's no kind of established path for how you develop a career in privacy. So it's not like you do A, B, C, bam, you're a privacy expert. So in terms of students and professionals now who have already been working, actually, I have someone who's been working for quite a few years, when they're thinking about how to navigate their career and build up towards something in the privacy space, any specific advice you might have?
Yeah, a ton. So I would say that this space is going to continue blowing up for the remainder of our collective earning years. I think I did not always believe that. I was a skeptic. I actually rode this through one turn of the wheel of fortune. So I had that first out of law school, crazy startup, everything went well. What I didn't mention, sort of one little chapter that I skipped, was after my first startup, before my second startup, privacy went away, 9/11 happened, right? So planes slammed into the World Trade Center and suddenly nobody cared about privacy at all for a couple of years. It was all about security. My entire professional discipline seemed precious. And nobody was interested in hiring a privacy expert. I was out of work for about 8 months. And it was humbling and humiliating and probably did me more good than anything else over sort of the duration of my career, but it was hard. I don't think that's going to happen again. So two things I would say now. I frequently have people come to me saying, like, how can I become you? Like, how can I just follow the map that you plotted out and get the job that you have? You won't, right? It's not going to happen unless you do. You're not going to do it in privacy. There will be one of these sort of adjacent things where I think those crazy serendipitous opportunities will be realized. Super high risk, crazy high reward, incredible velocity. However, in privacy, there is an outrageous amount of opportunity, I would say, for the next 10, 15 years at a minimum. And it is a great moment to be doing it because there is still a talent deficit. There is a sort of a pig in the python of demand coming between the GDPR in Europe and all of the enforcements that's happening there, the legislative changes that are happening in the US, Asia Pacific is happening as well. Like there is just this global trend towards more responsible information management and data governance. That's going to create a handful of new career tracks. Some of them are already taking shape for lawyers. For example, if you went back enough years, the privacy practice was sort of a backwater where lawyers who couldn't generate enough billings in a more sort of high performing practice would find themselves. That's not true anymore. This is the fastest growing area of the law. They're producing more billings than anywhere else. You're getting the best and the brightest in this profession, not like in the days when I came into it. And there's a clear career path there. I give this advice every day to someone. If you go to a top school, go to a big firm, do your 4 or 5 years, develop a diverse sort of portfolio of clients that are interesting, really build sort of, and then you'll go in-house. And then once you're in-house, you have that pivot point. You can decide, do I want to be a partner at a big law firm? Consulting in the space, you'll make piles of money. You'll have a certain kind of life that might appeal to some. Or you can go and you can do the in-house thing and you can become a chief privacy officer. You can become a chief data officer, chief risk, there's all chief compliance officer, all kinds of opportunities in that direction as well. That career is maturing in real time, tons of opportunity. If anybody wants to follow up with me directly, I'm happy to kind of give you some more direction on that one. In parallel, there's this privacy engineering discipline, and then a whole bunch of adjacent disciplines around it. That one is still maturing. So it's come very, very far, I would say, over the last 6 or 7 years. Top schools are beginning to think about how do we train people to be privacy engineers? What's the right hybrid of public policy, technical experience? I don't think anybody's totally solved the riddle yet, but that's getting better. And we can't hire privacy engineers fast enough. We have a team of probably 600 people in our privacy and data protection office, a large percentage of which are in fact privacy engineers. It's a great career ladder to be on at Google. And we are constantly playing defense because folks are trying to poach our talent for every companies of all shapes and sizes all over the world. So that's a great place to be. And then all the things is like in UX, in research and design, almost any discipline now is going to have some career in privacy and data protection, and they're going to evolve in really interesting ways over the next several years. I think there's no generic answer to say this is the thing you should do to be in privacy. A couple of things. There's certifications that are widely recognized now. The International Association of Privacy Professionals, I used to sit on the board. They offer an array of professional certifications. Those now are increasingly expected, I think, for the most interesting jobs. They're great ways to kind of learn the taxonomy, learn the semantics, and then going to the events at that particular organization. It's a great way to build your social graph, get to know people that are in the profession. And the hiring demand is just so rabid that when you are at those events, once you build a social graph, you tend to be showered with opportunities. So again, I'm totally sincerely happy. If any of you would like to reach out directly or through Shuo, I will give whatever advice I can. I'm happy to connect you with relevant opportunities or give you a steer in the right direction if I can be helpful.
Thank you so much for that. I think that's just such honest, sincere, and super practical advice. I think I've gotten one really interesting question that's kind of different than all the other questions. This is from V. The question is, this is probably the last question for you as we, right before we move into our roundtable session. But the question is, can the evolution of privacy become similar to Asimov's rule of robotics, basically summarized on just a few pages and easily digestible for everyone? This is like a very future-looking question. So
yeah, no, I love it. It's interesting. I need to refresh my foundation series. I have not read that in many, 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 many years. So this is the goal, right? Like what we need, we have a challenge that we are facing right now, which is technology is becoming increasingly ubiquitous. Users are producing a growing amount of digital exhaust just in the course of living their lives. And the distinction between online and offline reality is going to become increasingly blurred, right? We think about traditional models like notice, choice, consent, like all of these words that we've historically used to navigate privacy responsibilities. They are strained and they're going to become increasingly strained. I like the idea of users consenting. Users consenting to things is clearly the right model. Nobody can be offended by that. The challenge that I think we all face is if I get up and I get into my sort of electric car that has self-driving capabilities, and I take it from Burlingame to Mountain View, I am probably going through 100,000 data transactions in the course of doing that. If I have to consent to each one of those and every permutation of those as they change day to day, everything breaks and technology becomes unusable. So there's a mythology that is overly simplistic that we can just, have, like the rules can be as simple as users consent to everything. That's not quite right. On the other hand, we shouldn't be usurping control from users either. Things shouldn't be happening with their data that they would not, if they understood all of the technical detail, that they would be uncomfortable with or that they wouldn't consent to. Navigating between those two poles is profoundly challenging, and it's getting more so as we move away from traditional human-machine interfaces and we're not using keyboards, and we might not always have audible signals. So sometimes we'll be interfacing with technology in ways that it's hard for us to even contemplate right now. Navigating the ways that we will think about privacy and data protection is only going to get more challenging. I don't delude people, and I don't sort of make promises that any of this is getting easier. We're on the cusp of it. One of the reasons this profession is going to stay so promising and highly energized, I think, for the foreseeable future, is the problem space. We are only beginning to understand it, and it is growing faster than our understanding of it is. So we need the best and brightest to be leaning in on it. I do think, yes, do no evil. Data should only be used sort of for the benefit of users. Like, there are lots of really interesting philosophical precepts that we should experiment with. And I love the notion of holding technology accountable for the ethical consequences of the things that people are able to do with it. That's a huge part of my job. We don't always get it right, but I can tell you, like, we sincerely do our best, and we're going to continue doing that. And yeah, I like the idea of let's make it as simple as possible, because that is our obligation to our users. They're not going to have the attention span. They're not going to have the time. And frankly, we shouldn't push all of the obligation on them to understand everything and to have to make informed decisions about everything that's happening. How do we empower them and give them confidence and keep them in control while still letting them realize all the benefits of technology in their day-to-day lives? That's the challenge.
I think that is the perfect concluding point to our session together today. Thank you so much for making time to share all of this advice with us, Keith. With that, we would love to invite you, as well as everyone who has been accepted to our roundtable, to join us in the separate breakout room for our roundtable, where I'm sure folks will unmute and turn on cameras to introduce themselves briefly and ask you their questions directly. I've gotten some really interesting ones that I'm sure they'll follow up on.
Cool. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.